Alex, welcome to the show. I'm really glad you could be here with us.
Great to be here, guys.
All right. I am thrilled to have you here because I've recommended fossil fuel stocks to all my readers. So
Oh, sweet.
I like the guy who's championing fossil fuels, um, and actually that's where I want to start. I think your perspective is really interesting because for a lot of people, this issue is purely a climate thing. They're on one side or another of the climate debate, and they say, "Oh, fossil fuels are ruining the atmosphere, et cetera, et cetera. They're making everything hotter and worse." And then on the other side, they say, "No, there's no scientific evidence for that. Fossil fuels are fine." But as I haven't read like every word of your book, Fossil Future, because I don't read every word of anybody's book ever, except for like great literature usually. But it's awesome to dip into it because just the random dipping in tells me that you are primarily a like you've got a positive attitude about this. You're a fossil fuel advocate. Fair to say, rather than a climate guy.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think it's mainly the context in which you think about climate. So you're
Yeah.
very right that the way this issue is presented as primarily a debate about climate change, which we can find fault with in part because that itself is an extremely vague term.
Mm-hmm.
So to make it a little bit more precise, I'd say we have mostly a debate about the climate impacts of fossil fuels, or maybe even a better way to say it is we're having a debate about the climate side effects of fossil fuels. So
Right.
when we burn fossil fuels, it puts more CO2 and other greenhouse gases, but CO2 is the main one we care about, into the atmosphere. And then what kind of effect does that have on warmth and then other kinds of climate related phenomena?
Right.
And that's a totally valid question. But if you think of it as the climate side effects of fossil fuels, then the other obvious question is, well, what about the benefits of fossil fuels? What about the reasons we're burning fossil fuels in the first place? You can never, with any product or technology, you can never, out of context, just discuss its side effects. And in particular with climate, we even just look at negative side effects. There's very little thought about, well, could some of these side effects be positive?
Right.
It's my background is philosophy, and this just once I started learning a little bit about this issue, it really struck me we're violating a basic rule of thinking because we're considering a product or technology, but we're only considering its negative side effects. Whereas what you want to do is you want to carefully weigh benefits and side effects, including positive side effects. And in the case of fossil fuels, it's even more of a problem because with most products and technologies, the benefits and the side effects are somewhat separate. Like you take an antibiotic, you get a rash. You can say, well, the benefit is more important than the rash or not, but the benefit, but you still have the rash no matter what. Whereas one thing with fossil fuels is they can actually cure their own side effects, and it's because they're providing energy. So energy allows you to do anything because it allows you to use machines, which basically allows you to do anything. So if you think about, well, if fossil fuels increase the incidence of drought as a negative side effect, they also give you the ability to alleviate drought as a benefit through things like irrigation and crop transport. And if you look at the macro picture over the last 100 years, we're dramatically safer from drought death and all manner of climate related disaster death. So what this points to is we're engaging in the wrong way of thinking in general. And with fossil fuels, it makes no sense. And if you start to look at the macro picture, you start to see, wait a second, maybe the benefits, including climate related benefits of fossil fuels, far outweigh the negative side effects,
Right.
in which case, just focusing on negatives and then saying, if there's negative, let's get rid of fossil fuels, that could be an apocalyptically bad way of thinking, which I think it is.
Right. So this is your contrast is how did you put it in the book? The human flourishing framework versus what did
Yeah,
you call it? The anti-impact framework, and the
you got it.
anti-impact framework being this sort of tendency to focus solely on the negatives. And I noticed at one point in the book you also dealt with everybody who thinks they know something talks about externalities, right? And it's always
Yeah, yeah.
but it's always negative externalities. All the econ students
Right.
always talk about negative externalities, but they don't talk about positive ones, and you do.
Well, so let's let me connect that to this idea of the human flourishing framework because
Okay.
I've sort of addressed one element of that. So the way I'd put what I've discussed so far
Mm-hmm.
is that we're not considering the full context with fossil fuels, right? Because we're
Right.
just looking at negative side effects versus carefully weighing benefits and all side effects, including uh, positive side effects. And then if you start to drill into it a little bit, you can see there's a huge tendency to exaggerate the negative side effects, which makes sense because if you're
Or
biased
catastrophize
against,
them, actually.
yeah, and we can talk about that. So catastrophize basically means to exaggerate the negatives and then ignore our ability to adapt to or master them, which again, it makes no sense with fossil fuels because the very it's not even our ability to adapt to climate challenges from fossil fuels is separate from fossil fuels. The same energy that gives us any climate challenges is the core of our ability to adapt to or master those, right? It's you power the irrigation machines, you power the heating and cooling, you power the infrastructure building, you power the storm warning system. So there's this kind of first level observation. If people get the book, which I hope they do, the first chapter is called Ignoring Benefits. And it's pointing out why are you just looking at the negatives? And the second chapter is called Catastrophizing Side Effects. So I'm glad you brought that up. Why are you just looking at negative side effects and then exaggerating them and ignoring the offsetting benefits? And then there's a question of, well, why are you doing this? And one way to think of it is, why do you have such a bias against fossil fuels? It's kind of like, if you see somebody who's like super anti-Semitic or something like this, and they just they'll see a Jewish person, they can only see negative things about them and they can't see positives. And you're like, what's going on here? Why can you you run into Einstein or something and you can only see negatives about him? But didn't he do some positive stuff? So there's always this question of when you run into a bias like that, what's going on? And one of my arguments is that when you see that kind of bias, there's almost always some sort of anti-human assumption and or anti-human value. So in the case of racism, including anti-Semitism, it's almost always this group of people isn't really human. Like they're not a real human, we're a real human. There's something about Jews that just makes them wrong. And in the case of fossil fuels, it's interesting. One of the assumptions I think is things that have a lot of impact destroy the earth. And so when I put it as the delicate nurturer assumption, nature exists in a delicate nurturing balance. Any significant human impact is going to destroy the balance and us with it. That's just an assumption, and it's a false assumption. It doesn't it's actually the opposite. So nature is what I call wild potential. It's dynamic, deficient, dangerous, and we have to impact it a lot to make it livable. That's how we made the earth a lot more livable by getting out of the cave, right? We didn't make it less livable.
Unnaturally livable, I believe.
Yeah. You're really paying, even if you didn't read all the words, you're paying attention to the right words. So you've got this one thing is we have this bias against things that have a lot of impact where we think they're going to lead to our destruction. That partially explains the bias against fossil fuels because we see, well, if they're having a lot of impact, even if they haven't ruined the world yet, of course they are going to. It's just this dogma that, well, of course we can't continue, right? It can't be, quote, sustainable. The idea of unsustainability comes from this idea of what I call the delicate nurture. And then there's a deeper thing. There's also values. So there's something about if somebody is really ignoring the benefits of fossil fuels, and once I start to go into them, you see, wait a second, this is something, energy is so important in human life. It allows us to become so productive and prosperous by using machines. There's nothing close to fossil fuels for the foreseeable future in terms of providing energy that's affordable, reliable, and available to billions of people in thousands of places. And then we're in a world where billions of people lack energy to a shocking degree. We have 3 billion people using less electricity than a typical American refrigerator. You can see, how could you ignore a benefit on that scale? That's not just some secret benefit. If you're in the know, if you're not in the know, then you just don't know. But what I come to is ultimately, if you're ignoring a benefit on that scale, you're not really concerned with human life. And that's a hard pill to swallow. But I'll give you an example, which I think is very illustrative. People who say today that we've destroyed the climate, which is a very common thing to say, right? We've destroyed the climate. The climate is worse than ever.
Nobody argues with
you. But interestingly, we have very clear data on how deadly the climate is because we can measure how many deaths are there from different climate disasters like storms and floods, extreme heat, extreme cold, etc. So anyone remotely familiar with it, or you just think in common sense, do more people die today from climate or 100 years ago? If you think about it that way, it's pretty obvious they died at higher rate 100 years ago because they didn't have the mastery, in part because they didn't have fossil fuels. And yet, so think about this. The climate is such that we are safer than ever from climate. We also derive more benefits than ever from climate because we can travel to nice climates, we can make them more comfortable, et cetera, et cetera. And yet people view it as the worst climate ever. Well, obviously, you're not measuring climate
No,
in human terms,
no.
right? How are you measuring climate? You're measuring climate on the basis of things are bad to the extent they're impacted by humans. And so when I call it the anti-impact framework, because it's the idea that human impact on nature is intrinsically immoral. That's the value issue. And then inevitably destructive. That's the assumption. And you could think of it as an anti-human religion that's focused on on impact. So basically it says the cardinal sin, like thou shalt not impact nature. And then if you do, then the nature God punishes you. And you can think of global warming as like it's a hell. It's the idea that we're going to hell because we sinned against nature. And that's really the framework that I call it the anti-impact framework, which is really an anti-human framework.
Yeah.
That's guiding so many people, including so many smart people who aren't aware of their philosophical assumptions, or in some cases they are, and they're just anti-human, but most just aren't aware. And that's what's causing them, whether they know it or not, they usually don't, to be so biased against this thing that makes the world so much better for humans, because they're trained not to think of whether the world is better for humans, but whether the world has been impacted by humans, and the more impact, the worse. And my argument is, well, human impact done intelligently is essential to our well-being, what I call our flourishing. So if you have an anti-impact framework, you have a toxic way of thinking about energy, where a really good form of energy you're going to think of as evil. And that's what I argue our culture is doing.
All right. Well, eloquently put. And some people, as you did point out, I believe, are blatantly anti-human and want, in fact, some people are blatant about wanting fewer humans on the planet, and they insist that we absolutely must reduce the population to a sustainable level, which is a bit absurd.
Now, some of them, now even within that, some of them will be more pro-human than others. I know that sounds a little odd, but you can think of it as some will say, well, I really love humans, but the Earth can only handle 4 billion of us. It's sad, but that's like some perfect number. They'll call it carrying capacity because that sounds scientific, even though you can't use carrying capacity with a productive species because there's no finite limit to carry us. Right. But there's another kind of, but often you see, okay, if they say, they say casually. So I give an example, this guy, Michael Mann, who's a leading climate scientist and activist on this issue.
Scientist,
and he just says, well, he is a scientist in a way. Yeah. I mean, he's a trained scientist.
Sure.
I think he's done a lot of bad in the world, but his perspective, he'll just casually say, you know what, the world should have 1 billion people. And he would say, oh yeah, I'm pro-human. I just want those 1 billion people to flourish. But really, if you can casually talk about wiping out 7/8 of the world's population, you don't seem to be driven by a love of humanity. And what you find is, in the end, a lot of these people, they just think humans are bad. They think we're the worst part of Earth. So it's like the opposite of the ancient Greek view, Sophocles, the Ode to Man, man is the best part of nature. No. It's the perfect Earth in their view is the Earth that would exist had human beings never existed. And I think a lot of humans accept, I call it human racism, because it's the idea that everything the human race does is bad and everything else the rest of nature does is good. I think human racism is very, to use a popular term, institutionalized. Like that's the worst racism we have today against our own species.
Yeah, Alex. I mean, this is.
Yeah, we do.
Alex, first, thanks for being here. When you mentioned your philosophy background, I'm wondering, and you've kind of just touched on it here with going to the Greeks and whatnot. What were the catalysts for you? Say go back 10 or 15 years or whatever it may be, to like arriving to this sort of framework where we're not valuing the positives in what is powering kind of the economy of the world versus intensely focusing on the negatives.
Well, so for me, it's let's see, what am I now? I'm 43. So this kind of really started when I was 18. So 25 years ago now. Not the energy piece of it, but the philosophy piece of it was that, of course, I grew up. I was born in 1980, so I grew up in a place called Chevy Chase, Maryland. So the East Coast, very kind of politically liberal type place. So we had a lot of environmental catastrophism, including climate catastrophism. I think when I was 15, 16, I started to be exposed to some non-kind of political left ideas, but I still had a lot of the green movement was presented very positively to me. And then I remember when I was 18, started getting into philosophy, and in particular, there were some students of the, or let's say philosophers who were kind of disciples of Ayn Rand, who's a philosopher that I came to be a huge fan of. But this was even before I read her. And they were talking about this idea of quote unquote environmentalism as anti-human. And they had a very powerful argument, which stuck with me, which was basically human beings survive and flourish by impacting nature. And this movement says that it's evil to impact nature. Therefore, this movement is against human survival and flourishing. And I started to see, not as well as I do now, but I started to see, well, the whole idea of green means minimize or eliminate human impact. That's an anti-human idea. And part of what I learned over time is that's camouflaged, because what they pretend is, oh, we're just against the unhealthy impacts, right? We're just against polluting the air, polluting the water, destroying some vital species or something like that.
Right.
But that's not really it. You can see they're against human impact across the board. And it's because their goal is not making the world livable for humans. At least the core of the movement isn't. It's making the world as dehumanized as possible. So in fact, the alleged opposition to pollution is just incidental. They don't really care. They don't care if our impact is good for us or bad for us. They think as long as we're impacting it, it's bad. They just know, oh, if you want to get these humans on board with this anti-human idea, pretend you only want to clean up their environment. Don't pretend you want to clean up nature of them, right? There's this expression sometimes, you're the carbon they want to reduce.
Yeah.
And that is sort of, it's you're the impact they want to reduce. Like you're the species they want to reduce. So I got this idea, and I got as like, it was really powerful, and it made me have a negative moral feeling toward a lot of the greens, which was very helpful. But I still wasn't at all, I still had no real positive feeling about fossil fuels. And I still wasn't, like climate catastrophism was still scary to me. I didn't know how to think about it. And that really came out of 9 years later when I started learning something about energy and fossil fuels. And I started realizing, wow, people aren't thinking about the benefits of this. And there are real benefits, because before you don't think about the benefits of energy, or you just assume, oh, solar and wind, they're probably just as good. And then you think, oh, wait, and we go into why, but they're nowhere close to being able to provide energy that's affordable, reliable, powering every type of machine for billions of people in thousands of places. And so, no, there are unique benefits to fossil fuels, which means there are unique harms from opposing them. And why isn't anyone thinking about them? And then I started to learn, wait, there are all these climate-related benefits too, and we're actually safer than ever from climate. And then that really woke me up. And I thought, well, this would be a really valuable thing to do, would be to change the thinking about this fundamental thing. Because I think of it as energy is the industry that powers every other industry. The lower cost energy is the lower cost everything is. So if you could improve the thinking about this huge lever in the world, that would be really good. And if you let it go the way it was going, that would be bad. So I found that very motivating.
Alex, I applaud the mission that you're on there. You remind me of a book by Ayn Rand called Anthem. Did you read Anthem?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, I've read Anthem.
That guy, he had a very positive thing to offer his society, too. They didn't take it very well.
Fortunately, our society takes mine better than he got. We're not quite at the level of, we have the council, and they destroy you for rediscovering the light bulb. Not to ruin the plot.
Right,
people,
right. But they're not throwing you in prison. But they're
no.
But let me ask you the question. Then I'll put it to you as a question. I know I was looking around on your websites and things, and you do work with various lawmakers and politicians. What kind of an impact then are you having there? How do you assess your impact? Maybe you don't really know, but how do you assess it?
So in politics in particular, it's been surprisingly positive. I mean, but keep in mind, I've been at this 17 years now. And one thing I think is a strength of mine is, to use a term in a different context, adapting, and not adapting like my environment is changing, but figuring out how to create the results that I want to create. And so one thing we found really, really useful in politics, and this is now I have a pretty significant team, starting in 2020, was the way to have an impact and to help to get more allies who would say and do the right things was to make it really easy for politicians who were inclined, who were pro-freedom in one way or another, to say and do the right thing. So we created something, and people can access a lot of it for free at the website energytalkingpoints.com, or we have a newsletter at alexepstein.substack.com. And the idea was take all of these issues we're talking about and break them down into Twitter-length talking points so that in any given situation, any politician would know here's exactly what to say about it. And we found that that was really helpful versus if I just hand them the book and say, hey, apply this, that's a lot of homework for somebody.
Right.
But if I can say, hey, you can just search our website, and if something comes up about fracking or climate, you can probably find it. And then on top of that, we added basically a free consulting service for major elected officials where they could text me or somebody else on our team and just ask if they have a question, which now happens all the time. And now we have something people can see it. I guess if you go to our Substack, you can learn about it. It's called Alex AI. So there's an AI now that we've invested a lot in that answers questions directly as me. Remind me after, I'll send you guys a free lifetime access to it. It's pretty fun. So what I found is that by turning my ideas into a very usable, powerful form that saves people time, that saves allies time, it's increased the utilization. And in fact, the next step is, so now we have 200 major political offices, U.S. Senate, U.S. House, and governor's offices using our stuff. I directly interface with probably 75 to 80 major politicians, just myself. And I was doing none of this before. So it's kind of, we already had all the ideas, fortunately, but we really cracked the code on how to do it. And now we're doing that in policy. So if there's a new administration, we're going to have, in collaboration with some others, we're going to have some really good, ready to go policies that, hey, if you want to fix nuclear, here's what to do. If you want to fix the EPA, here's what to do. If you want to fix the grid, here's what to do. And I have no power over anyone, but I have the power to create, along with my team, to create really good stuff and to make it really easy to use. And that seems to be enough.
Yeah. That's all you can do. You can lead them to water, but you can't make them drink. I understand that.
But if it's really good water,
yeah,
they will often drink.
That's right.
Hey, I gotta ask, what are the most common texts or questions you're getting right now from the members of Congress?
Well, it's often very specific to what they're doing. So I'll just give you categories. So one is, we have a hearing with X major official. What should I ask them? So that's one I've been having fun with a lot lately, because I'm not going to share my technique because I don't want to ruin it for everyone. But I think I have really good ways of asking bad elected officials questions that you can kind of make it really hard for them to weasel out of. Because I've done a lot of testimony myself, and I would say I'm quite good at being the person asked the questions, but I'm telling the truth. Like I hate it when people who aren't telling the truth weasel out of it. So there are ways you can ask questions to weasel out. So one thing is helping them with questions. A lot of times they ask for fact checks. So they're like, hey, I'm considering tweeting this out. Is this true? And then half the time it's not true, because even on the good side of things, people spread stuff that's not true all the time. So there's often a very common one is, oh, here's an argument from the other side. What about this? Sometimes it's more aspirational. Hey, I want to work on a policy on something. So just all kinds of things, whatever they need. But fortunately, because it's not very hard to do, because we're just thinking about this stuff all the time. And so, I'm glad they reach out, and we could handle even more of it.
All right. I'm glad we talked about that. It's nice to hear somebody, it's nice to hear the politicians actually want to hear from somebody like you. And I just want,
so far so good.
So far so good. That's right. As long as they're still, hitting the email and ringing the phone, right? But there's one thing I'm too curious about here. Laying all your cards on the table, then, telling the truth about your view here. Where do you come down on the issue of climate? For myself,
I thought you were going to ask a way more provocative question.
No. I mean, well, believe it or not,
you can ask anything. By the way, it's just funny. It's just funny because that's something I talk about constantly.
Right. For you, that's a softball, but I've been focusing solely on your your fossil fuel advocacy and your ideas about human flourishing and the benefits of fossil fuels, et cetera, and the the unnaturally livable planet that we live on, which is amazing, by the way. But I'm just curious, the issue has to come up, even though you are primarily a fossil fuel advocate, it seems to me. Like, what are your views on that? Like, do you think we're really headed for, some kind of a climate emergency or not?
Well, so I would definitely not think of myself primarily as a fossil fuel advocate. I'd say I'm an energy freedom advocate. So I want the freedom to produce and use all forms of energy, so long as you're, avoiding unreasonable endangerment of people and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm a fossil fuel advocate mainly because fossil fuels are being oppressed, and that's the number one way in which we're doing damage to energy freedom and, as a result, human life. I'm a huge nuclear advocate, and in terms of fundamentals, in a sense, I like nuclear more than fossil fuels. I mean, it has certain attributes that are more exciting. Mm-hmm. And I work a lot on nuclear issues, and I'm working a lot on them now. But fossil fuels are the most existential thing. Like, the war on fossil fuels is one of the most high leverage things in the world right now in terms of destruction.
Mm-hmm.
So I happen to be a fossil fuel advocate because of the current economics of fossil fuels.
Understood.
And because of the current immoral opposition to fossil fuels. In terms of climate, I mean, a lot of what I've already said shapes my view, because basically I think that I'll start off with, let's talk about what's happened so far, and then let's use that as a jumping off point to talk about the future. Because I always think if you can't acknowledge the present, you can't predict the future. And most people don't even acknowledge the present. So the present reality is that we're currently in a climate renaissance. So currently, like at this moment, right, the climate has never been more livable for human beings, mostly because our level of mastery has far, far outpaced any kinds of challenges. So if you take today's climate system and our ability to deal with it versus 100 years ago, there's just no comparison at all. The death rate, I've mentioned this, I don't know if I mentioned it today, but the death rate from climate disasters has fallen by a factor of 50 over the last 100 years. So this is important because people claim we're in a crisis now. And like, if you think we're in a crisis now, you're not measuring it in human terms. You just, so I always want to, when we're making predictions, I want to know what's your yardstick, right? What's your, I call it standard of evaluation. I think the main thing is people are just treating climate impact as intrinsically bad. So they think if we've had an impact, that must be bad. Whereas my view is impact can be good or bad. The main thing is our overall effect should be good, and our overall effect on climate has been amazingly good. So then the question is, what do we know about mastery, and what do we know about climate science that can inform the future? So we know about mastery. It's really easy for mastery, like building sturdy buildings and storm warning systems, irrigation, heating and cooling. Like, the mastery we have now is already very capable. We also know that down the line, there's good evidence. People are afraid of this, but I think fundamentally it's a good thing. Like, we'll be able to warm and cool the earth at will in the future. I think it's pretty straightforward that we'll be able to do both of those. Certainly cooling, we know how to do pretty well already. I mean, volcanoes erupt and it cools the earth. You can inject, they've done what are called geoengineering experiments, which is a little bit of a scary sounding way of doing it, but of talking about it. But bottom line, our mastery is going to increase in many, many different kinds of ways. And you can be concerned about, we'll use that mastery in negative ways, just like any technology you can be concerned about.
Right.
But what that shows you is our ability to deal with any problems, natural or man-made, is going to increase, and it could increase rapidly. So in that context, in terms of what are going to be the future climate side effects of fossil fuels, to be really concerned, they would need to be a total difference in kind from what we've experienced the last 100 years. We've already been putting a bunch of CO2 in the atmosphere, right? Mm-hmm. We've been running this experiment, and we've seen that it's warmed about 1 degree Celsius, 2 degrees Fahrenheit. And so we don't know how much of that comes from fossil fuels, but let's say all of it comes from fossil fuels. Even there, mainstream climate science says that the greenhouse effect is a logarithmic or diminishing effect. So what it means is, as you add more CO2, the CO2 diminishes in its warming power. So you get, diminishing returns. It's not an acceleration. And this is why we used to have 10 times more CO2. The planet didn't burn up because, again, CO2 gets weaker over time as you add more of it to the atmosphere. So the warming tends to level off. And then in terms of, so the warming isn't really that scary. It basically means the planet, and the warming occurs more in cold places. It occurs more at night. It occurs more in winter. Right. So basically it means the planet slowly becomes more tropical. And then in terms of storms, there's not much that definitive, but maybe it'll increase some in intensity, but not that significantly. Wow. And then sea levels would be the main thing to be concerned about. Mm-hmm. And that they're rising really slowly. So they're rising about a foot a century right now. Extreme projections are 3 feet a century. Even that you could deal with pretty straightforwardly. So I think what we find is that even mainstream climate science, if you put it in context, which is what people aren't doing, right. If you put it in the context of our climate mastery from fossil fuels and the other benefits from mm-hmm. fossil fuels, yep. Then you don't become that scared about the issue or even that interested in the issue. Because the real thing is, it's kind of like, if you're concerned about any threat, including climate, what you want to do is maximize your capabilities as a society. Just like if there's a new COVID that's 5 times worse, the main thing is you want to have as robust an economy as possible so that you can deal with it and you can be wealthy. So that it's so crazy to think we might have a climate problem, so let's get really poor to prepare ourselves.
Yeah, that's right. There's a popular meme about people sitting in a cave and, wearing like caveman furs and things. And they said, well, we're at net zero. What do we do now? So it's sort of.
Well, that's the point. Like one way of thinking of it is, I talk a lot about poorer areas, including, Africa, which has the most energy poverty in the world. And they'll say like, hey, Namibia needs to commit to net zero. I'm like, no, that's the problem. Yeah. Is they're already close to net zero. Yeah. Like, they need to get away from net. And even notice, by the way, the net zero is the worshiping of no impact. Right. So it's saying our number one goal should be to be a zero. Right. That's not a pro-human view. Like, who wants for their kids? No. Like, my goal in life is for you to be net zero.
Yeah, but Alex, do most people not kind of sense this? I mean, I don't really know anybody. I see a few people around who are maybe, they've got solar panels on the roof and they're driving a Prius or something, or an electric car or something. But most people, don't they just kind of get on with it and they sort of sense that it just doesn't fly?
I wouldn't put it, there's something to that. And I think something that's not quite right about that. I mean, what's not quite right about that is the goal of rapidly eliminating fossil fuels, which usually goes under net zero or carbon neutral. Mm-hmm. That's become politically popular, or at least acceptable enough, where that's literally the number one political goal in the world right now. Nations have all basically, except the United States under Trump, more or less, maybe one other in recent years, have not united. They've all united around, let's get rid of fossil fuels. At least saying that's the moral ideal and then committing to it. Whether they won't actually do it to the degree they're doing it, but they're taking actions in that direction in many cases. So right. It's not incidental to people's practical political values. It's in fact dominating practical politics. But then at the same time, you see people they act like it's nuclear war, mm-hmm. or how people used to fear nuclear war. They act like that in their rhetoric. So they say existential threat. Biden in particular loves that term, existential threat, a threat to our existence. But they don't really live like that day to day. In the same way that if you're, it's during the Cold War, you hear, hey, Russia's surpassed us in X, people being really scared to their core right. about this. That's not happening with climate. It's more of a people like to pretend that they're scared about it, but they're not actually that scared about it. Yeah. I think that's in part because it relates to, on some level, they know this is not the biggest thing in the world. Yeah. And also we've been hearing about it for a while, and still most days, I'm in California, still a nice day most days, we're doing pretty well. And so I think there's a certain amount of fatigue over it. So that can be leveraged in terms of, if you give people the understanding of what's actually going on, then they're pretty open to it. But it is important to give them that understanding, because absent that understanding, even if they're not truly obsessed with it emotionally, politically, it's still dominating.
I see what you're saying. And it is a sort of politically, it's sort of a sloppy thing that people will just say, yeah, but I'm for the environment, so I want to do X, Y, Z, whatever politician says. So I do get
Yeah,
that.
that is
actually.
interesting.
Yeah.
I didn't think of it that way as far as
maybe
like, it is one of those huge political points. Yeah, that in all elections now, right? It's there. But also one of my favorite examples that comes to mind here is like somebody tweeting about net zero from their iPhone, which is plugged into the wall or something. Like we there's a loss of context here. When you're using all of these things that require fossil fuels.
Right.
Well, and Apple lies. Unfortunately, there's a huge amount of sanctioned dishonesty on this issue. We put out a piece on, you can see it on the Substack, alexepstein.substack.com, about the tech giants and AI, and basically how, and I love tech giants, by the way, fundamentally. I'm not at all hostile to quote unquote big tech, but I am hostile to the fact that for years, most of these companies have been anti-fossil fuels and have materially harmed our grid by calling for directly or indirectly the shutdown, particularly of coal plants, not building enough natural gas plants, or particularly natural gas infrastructure, which we need the more natural gas we're going to use. And part of what they've done is they've claimed, well, we're 100% renewable. So Apple claims to be 100% renewable, Google, Meta, right? And it's all lies. It's all lies. Right. And it's a very simple thing they do at the core, which is they literally pay utilities to give them credit for other people's renewable electricity and give others blame for their non-renewable electricity. Because everyone's on the grid. The grid, you just homogenize whatever, you can't go on the grid and just consume the solar out of the grid. That doesn't physically happen. Mm-hmm. So if the grid is 25% solar, which is a lot, even there, but let's say it's 25% solar on average, and then you pay your local utility to say, well, the 75% that's not solar or wind, we're going to just take that from other people's, and then they're going to get the blame for your natural gas. Right. Like, it's so, and the FTC allows this, which is crazy. Like, this should just be, it's obvious fraud in my view. And I'm working on some political stuff to change this, but it's so damaging that everyone is taught to think, oh yeah, my iPhone, the Apple Watch is carbon neutral, but Apple is 100% renewable. It totally distorts people's view of reality because they think, well, all these successful companies are 100% renewable, so no big deal if the country pursues a Green New Deal. It's like, no, they're not 100% renewable. If they tried to be, they would immediately collapse and you would never have an iPhone again. So let's beware of this idea.
Right. And not to mention, if we go a level deeper, the whole idea of renewability itself is it's phony. There is no renewability. I mean, the sun will burn out one day in a billion
That's a
years.
very that's a very philosophical point, which is an important one, because it's and even a more even near-term thing is all these components of these things are not quote unquote renewable.
Of solar
right? So
cells and wind. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, of course, the whole infrastructure, right? So you can't look at, like, if you're looking at a process, this is a key idea of considering the full context. You need to look at every element of the process. You can't just say, oh, the sun is free, therefore solar energy is free. Because the sun is not equivalent to the energy. It's just it's a portion, it's a component of producing the energy. And this idea of renewables also related to this anti-impact framework. It's the idea that, well, we only should be allowed to use things that we can use forever, and then it'll never make an impact on anything. Like, we have no right to impact the earth. We're just sort of imposters here. Everyone else can impact it, all the other species, but not us. Versus, no. The way we survive and flourish is we are taking non-renewable, not even resources. It's actually non-renewable raw materials, because they're not even mostly resources until we intelligently manipulate them. We're constantly figuring out how to take raw material and make it valuable. And what we constantly do is we figure out how to take things that aren't resources and make them resources. Aluminum used to be useless. Now it's an incredible resource. Same for oil, same for coal, same for natural gas. So we should take pride in a species that we're not sustainable in the sense of living a repetitive circular life. We're actually evolving, or even, to use a dreaded word, progressive. Like, we progressively learn how to use the earth in new and better ways. And we should embrace that. And we should be grateful to our ancestors who used all those, quote, non-renewable resources, because they advanced us. and our successors will be grateful, because ultimately what we leave them with, most of all, in addition to infrastructure, is knowledge.
Right.
And the more knowledge you have about how to master the earth, the more anything is a resource.
Yeah. So Julian Simon, the late great economist, wrote a book called The Ultimate Resource, and then The Ultimate Resource 2. The ultimate resource being the thing between your ears. That's
exactly.
the ultimate resource, And this,
so he was unfortunately very unappreciated during his life, even though he was you still read him now, and he's very vindicated. Yeah, Ultimate Resource 2 is the more up to date. And he also recognized, he called energy the master resource, which is really a profound recognition as well. That this is the resource beneath every of the kind of physical, non-mental resources. This is the one that makes possible every other resource, because if you have enough energy, you can make everything else.
Right. You remind me of Vaclav Smil when you talk that way. He has a great little book called How the World Really Works, and he points out that modern cities, I believe he said, and I would say modern civilization, is made of 4 materials: concrete, steel, plastics, and ammonia, and try getting any of those without a lot of fossil fuels. You need to get them at scale, and fossil fuels are the only thing you can produce that much energy with at that kind of scale, except for nuclear, of course.
He's great, by the way. Vaclav is interesting because he's really great on the facts about how the world works.
Yep.
We do, if you read us, though, you might notice that we do differ considerably on the philosophy. So I think he thinks of a lot of civilization as a necessary evil.
Yeah.
And kind of like, we would like to be net zero, but we can't, and stuff like that. And I think he thinks of it as more ugly and unfortunate.
Yeah,
and I think they're
an
ugly.
anti-impact
People
to
do
a degree.
He has you got it. So he has a lot of that anti-impact framework, but he's sort of profoundly knowledgeable about the facts, and I think generally very honest from everything I've seen. Yeah, I've read quite a bit of his stuff about the facts. So he's a great factual resource. But I would just, since we're talking about philosophy, I think it'd be interesting when you're, and I would, not just him, but other people, when you're reading people, ask, like, how much are they really viewing the world from a human flourishing perspective versus an anti-human impact perspective? And I think you'll notice a lot of people, even people who are less anti-fossil fuel, have a lot of anti-humanism that they've picked up.
Yeah. Where did this come from? Where did this, I mean, I remember in my days of reading Ayn Rand, she went all the way back to Plato, but she really focused on Immanuel Kant as kind of the ultimate, one of the ultimate sort of, closer to the modern era anti-human philosophers. Where do you think?
I think it's the first time, one of the first, well, he's definitely related. I don't even usually bring him up because it's so... It takes more to, but I can explain. Yeah. So and then, but why not? Let's
Dan's
do it. It's
your
fine.
guy.
We're here. So the one of the
I said Dan's your guy for this.
What's that?
It up, so yeah.
Good. Yeah. So well, the kind of more obvious parallels people see is you can, with this idea of the delicate nurture and human impact destroys us, you can see this in primitive religions before we understand any kind of science, where there's some understandability to, we're afraid of our impact on the earth because we don't understand how it works. So this idea, well, if it rains and we didn't want it to rain, or if it doesn't rain and we did want it to rain, that must be because we sinned against the earth, right? So there's that kind of perspective. That has no place in modern science, but unfortunately it's very big. Like, that's a lot of the global warming is like, literally we sinned against nature, versus even if there's a problem, it's just that there are certain climate physics and we activated this driver. And so it has these consequences, negative and positive. And if you think they're more negative, but you think of it very clinically, you don't think of it as nature punished us or something like that. That's a very much kind of primitive religious view. So that's part of it. But then there's a question of, well, why do people believe this, and why do people not just think of it as, why do they believe this despite the fact we know that our impact is generally good for us? And then why is there this hostility toward humans and toward humans benefiting? And you can look at more philosophers like Rousseau. It's more obvious, where he has a hostility toward industry, and you can see different people who think there's just something wrong with us using their minds. Kant is a little bit. It's a more abstract connection, but in a sense more profound. I think one of the things with Kant is he's sort of more deeply against human. Now, people consider this controversial, but I think ultimately it stands up. He's more deeply against human interest, self-interest, and pursuit of happiness than really anyone ever. And his whole concept is very abbreviated, but his whole concept of morality is around the idea of duty. Like, you do something because it is your duty to do it. And
Moral
it's not
imperative.
you do your but it's called a categorical imperative, right?
Yes, thank you.
So you do it, but in philosophy there's a categorical imperative, which basically means you do it because you do it, and there's nothing really behind that. It's just what you have to do. Yep. Versus something called a hypothetical imperative, which is you do it because if I do X, then I'll do Y. And with Kant, it's really, so he'll go through different scenarios. Well, why should you do your duty? Is it because even it'll make you feel better about helping others? Which I think is a problematic justification anyway, but he'll say, no, it's not that. And it's not because you benefit in any way. It's just because it's your duty. And I think of this as a long discussion, but I think this is a very corrupt idea that people should just do things when there's nothing in it for them and nothing in it for their happiness. They should just do it to do it, and there's nothing behind that. I think that's very corrupting, and it's very it's unnecessary, because what capitalism has shown us is we can all survive and prosper together. So we don't need to sacrifice ourselves. We don't need to be miserable. We can all potentially be happy together. So why would you embrace not that? But part of it is when you have this idea of duty to some higher thing and you just obey it, it's really easy to pick up this idea of, well, let's not just sacrifice to some human collective like the communists said. Let's sacrifice to the non-human. Like, that's even better in a sense. That's even less selfish, right? Because if you sacrifice to the humans, at least humans are benefiting. But there's some appeal if you're like, you really get Kant, like, let's just sacrifice to dirt. Let's sacrifice to nothing. Like, that's really what it amounts to, is that we're sacrificing for this God of an unimpacted earth. And it's not about, if you see, I was on Jordan Peterson's podcast and we had an interesting discussion about this. He tended, I think maybe I moved him some on this, but like, he tended to think of it, no, people are like, they want the earth to be greener and more full of other life. And so why don't they like fossil fuels? Because that greens the planet and stuff. And it's like, it's not about the other life. It's about anti-us. So they're not against human impact because they love the bears so much. In fact, they think it's bad if we nurture the bears and they think it's bad because we did it. And Kant, I think, is really not exactly the father, but the father of the purest version of human self-interest is evil. You shouldn't do anything out of self-interest. Sacrifice for ultimately your duty, for ultimately for nothing, is the ideal. And I think that's environmentalism is the pure version. There's a really good essay in one of Ayn Rand's collections, which is an updated collection called Return of the Primitive. And there's something called the Philosophy of Privation by a guy named Peter Schwartz, who was very helpful to my thinking. And at the very beginning, if I recall correctly, he brings up Kant and he says environmentalism is essentially like the pure fulfillment. Like, the communists couldn't even do it, even though they were influenced by Kant, by Hegel and Marx. But like, the environmentalists are the pure version, because it's just sacrifice for the sake of sacrifice. So anyway, you asked, that's my answer.
No, good answer. I'm glad we got into that. Well, look, I believe in leveraging my guest. I mean, if you're a philosophy guy from way back, and you work for Cato, Ayn Rand Institute. I mean, I want to, I want to let you fly, man. I want to let you express those views in the way that's comfortable to you. So I don't I'm not Howard Stern. I don't want to be like a shock jock arguing with people and trying to humiliate them or whatever. That style just doesn't work. So
that would be fun. Go there. That would be fun in its own way. But for some, not for us. It's perfect amount of time for my final question, which is the identical question for every guest, no matter what the topic, financial or non-financial, like we're talking about today. Same question. If you've already said the answer, by all means, feel free to recap it. But it's a very simple question. If you could leave our guests with a single thought today, what would it be? I would probably just, why not just this idea of, we're obviously thinking of climate in an anti-human way. So that's not my most fundamental thought, but it's a like this idea of we're safer than ever from climate. We derive more benefit than ever from climate, and yet we think of climate as the worst it's ever been. So if something is the best it's ever been for humans, and we have access to that evidence, and we think it's the worst it's ever been, our standard of evaluation has nothing to do with human welfare and has to be anti-human in some form. And my contention is it's this idea of human impact is evil. So zero human impact as the standard. But I think that example is one that's hard to argue with. So I would, if people are skeptical of like, why do you need philosophy? Could this guy be right? Well, if everyone is measuring the thing by an anti-human standard, including many scientists, then maybe I'm right that it's not an issue of people have the facts all wrong. They have some of the facts all wrong, but ultimately they have the goal wrong. And because they have the goal wrong, they're not looking at all the relevant facts. And I'm just saying, I'm going to look at climate and the earth and everything else from a human perspective, and I'm going to bring together all the relevant facts about that, including all the benefits, including climate benefits of fossil fuels. And the other people aren't doing that. So I'm not claiming I've got a revolutionary refutation of modern climate science. I'm claiming it shouldn't be revolutionary. Unfortunately, it is, because it's pretty common sense. I have a revolutionary way of contextualizing climate science.
All right. Listen, Alex, thanks a lot for being here. Like I said, I've enjoyed the parts of the book that I've dipped into. And, I think I can recommend the book. I think I've read enough of it that I can recommend it to our listeners. Fossil Future by Alex Epstein. And you can get it at all the usual places, I'm sure. Thanks very much. I really enjoyed talking with you. I wish we could do it for 3 hours instead of just one.
Awesome, guys. Well, it was a lot of fun. Thanks for having me.
Opinions expressed on this program are solely those of the contributor and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Stansberry Research, its parent company, or affiliates.